On my wedding day, a lawyer walked into the church with a leather folder that changed my life forever. I found out that my father, who I thought was just a simple man, had left me an inheritance filled with secrets he had kept his whole life. I never expected my wedding day to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. But there I was at 6 a.m, staring at my reflection in the hotel mirror, wearing my grandmother's dress, and feeling like the world was about to crack open beneath my feet. The ivory lace felt heavier than it should have, like it was carrying secrets I wasn't ready to understand. My hands were shaking, not from wedding nerves, but from something deeper, something that had been building in my chest since I woke up from the strangest dream about my father, who died when I was 12. The Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs buzzed with early morning energy, staff members rushing through the hallways with flowers and champagne, preparing for what was supposed to be the most perfect day of my life. I pressed my palms against the cool window glass, looking out at the Rocky Mountains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, their peaks still dusted with snow, even though it was late May. Those mountains had always made me feel small, but today they made me feel invisible, like I was disappearing into something I couldn't control. Mom knocked softly on the door, her voice muffled through the thick wood. "Sarah, honey, the photographer wants to start in 20 minutes. Her tone carried that forced cheerfulness she always used when she was trying to keep something heavy from spilling out. I'd been hearing that tone my entire life, but I never understood what she was protecting me from until today, until everything changed. "Coming, Mom." My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, thin and uncertain. I smoothed the dress one more time, watching how the morning light caught the delicate beadwork my grandmother had sewn by hand in 1952. She'd told me once that every stitch held a wish for happiness, but standing there, I wondered if some wishes were too dangerous to make real. The dress fit perfectly, like it had been waiting 28 years for me to fill it, but I felt like I was wearing someone else's story. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt endless. Mom stood beside me, fidgeting with her pearl necklace, the same nervous habit she'd had since I was little. "You look beautiful, sweetheart. Your father would be so proud." Her voice cracked slightly on the word father, and I saw her catch herself, like she'd said something she shouldn't have. That's when I noticed her hands were trembling too, and not from excitement. "Mom, are you okay?" I reached for her arm, but she pulled away gently, giving me one of those smiles that never quite reached her eyes. The same smile she'd been giving me for 16 years, ever since Dad died in that car accident on Interstate 25. The same smile that always made me feel like she was protecting me from something I was too young, too naive, too fragile to understand. But I wasn't 12 anymore, and that protective wall she'd built around our family's history was starting to show cracks. "I'm fine, honey. Just emotional. It's a big day." But her voice sounded hollow, like she was reading lines from a script she'd memorized long ago. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and we stepped into the grand lobby where my bridesmaids were waiting, dressed in sage green and laughing over mimosas. They looked like they belonged in a magazine spread about perfect Colorado weddings, all sunshine and mountain air and uncomplicated joy. My best friend Jessica rushed over, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that only comes from someone else's special day. "Oh my God, Sarah, you look absolutely stunning. This dress is incredible." She touched the lace sleeve reverently. "I can't believe your grandmother made this by hand. The craftsmanship is museum quality." But even as she spoke, I could see her studying my face with the concern of someone who'd known me since college. "Hey, you okay? You look a little pale." Wedding nerves. The lie came so easily I almost believed it myself. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about marrying David. I loved him with the kind of certainty that had surprised everyone who knew me, including myself. We'd met 2 years ago when my marketing firm was hired to promote his architectural practice, and what started as professional collaboration had become something neither of us expected. He was everything I'd never thought I wanted. Steady, thoughtful, the kind of man who brought me coffee without being asked and remembered the names of my coworkers' kids. The photography session began in the hotel's rose garden, the morning sun casting everything in golden light that should have felt magical, but instead felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. Jessica and my other bridesmaids, Megan and Caroline, chattered excitedly as the photographer posed us among the blooming flowers, but their voices sounded distant, underwater. I kept thinking about my father, about the dream I'd had, where he was standing in a field I'd never seen before, wearing a suit that was too expensive for the man I remembered. "Sarah, can you give me a genuine smile?" The photographer, an energetic woman named Claire, crouched down with her camera. "Think about seeing David at the altar." I tried to summon that feeling, that flutter of anticipation I'd been carrying for months, but instead, I kept seeing my father's face from the dream, the way he'd looked at me with such sadness, like he was trying to tell me something important but couldn't find the words. My father had been a simple man, or at least that's what I'd always believed. He worked for a small construction company, drove a 10-year-old pickup truck, and spent his weekends teaching me how to fish in the streams that wound through the Colorado foothills. He wore the same flannel shirts until they fell apart, told terrible jokes that made Mom roll her eyes, and never seemed to want anything more than our little family and the modest ranch house on the outskirts of Denver where we lived. When he died, we struggled financially for years, Mom working double shifts as a nurse while I got scholarships and part-time jobs to make ends meet. But in my dream, he'd been wearing a perfectly tailored suit, standing beside a black luxury car I'd never seen before. He'd looked at me with those familiar brown eyes, but there was something different about him, something that suggested depths I'd never known existed. "Sweetheart," he'd said in the dream, his voice exactly as I remembered it. "There are things your mother never told you, things I never got the chance to explain." Then he'd handed me a key, old and ornate, unlike anything that belonged in our simple life. "When you're ready, this will help you understand." I woke up clutching my pillow, my heart racing with a grief that felt fresh and new, even though he'd been gone for 16 years. The dream had felt so real I'd actually looked around my hotel room for the key, which was ridiculous. My subconscious was obviously just processing wedding stress in a weird way. At least, that's what I told myself as I got ready for the most important day of my life. "Ladies, we need to head to the church in 15 minutes, Mom announced, checking her watch with the precision of someone who'd spent years coordinating everything alone. She'd been both parents to me since Dad died, and she'd done it with a strength that still amazed me. But today, something about her seemed different. She kept checking her phone, glancing toward the hotel entrance like she was expecting someone, and every time she looked at me, I caught a flash of something that looked almost like fear. The drive to St. Mary's Cathedral took us through downtown Colorado Springs, past the familiar landmarks of the city where I'd grown up. The chapel where David and I had chosen to marry sat nestled against the foothills, its stone walls and stained glass windows creating the perfect backdrop for what was supposed to be our fairy tale beginning. But as our car pulled into the parking lot, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A man in an expensive charcoal suit stood near the church entrance, holding a leather briefcase that looked older than I was. He was probably in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested importance, authority. What made me stare wasn't his appearance, though. It was the way he was watching our car, like he'd been waiting specifically for us to arrive. Mom saw him too, and I heard her sharp intake of breath, watched her fingers grip her purse until her knuckles went white. "Mom, who is that?" But she was already getting out of the car, her face set in the kind of determined expression she wore when she had to deliver bad news to families at the hospital. The man approached us slowly, respectfully, like he understood he was interrupting something sacred but had no choice. "Mrs. Coleman." His voice was gentle but professional, the tone of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing information. "I'm Robert Henley. I apologize for the timing, but I have something that belongs to your daughter, something her father left specific instructions about." He looked directly at me then, and I felt that same strange recognition I'd experienced in my dream, like he was connected to a part of my life I'd never known existed. Mom's face had gone completely pale. "Mr. Henley, we discussed this. Today is not appropriate." But her voice lacked conviction, like she'd known this moment would come eventually, and had simply been hoping it wouldn't be today, on my wedding day, in front of the church where my bridesmaids were probably wondering why we weren't inside yet. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Coleman, but the instructions were very clear. The materials were to be delivered on the day of Sarah's wedding, before the ceremony." He turned back to me, his expression both apologetic and determined. "Miss Coleman, your father left something for you. Something he wanted you to have before you began your new life." The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. I looked between Mom and this stranger who apparently knew things about my father that I didn't, and I felt that familiar curiosity that had always gotten me into trouble rising in my chest like a tide. I'd spent my entire life asking questions until I got answers, driving teachers and friends and boyfriends crazy with my need to understand everything completely. It was a trait that had served me well in my marketing career, but it had also caused problems when people preferred to keep things simple, surface level, uncomplicated. "What kind of something?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Behind me, I could hear car doors slamming as more guests arrived, the cheerful chatter of people gathering for a celebration. But I couldn't move, couldn't take my eyes off this man who was holding what looked like the key to questions I didn't even know I should be asking. Mr. Henley glanced at Mom again, seeking permission he clearly didn't need, but was asking for out of courtesy. When she gave a barely perceptible nod, he opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope that looked like it had been waiting decades to be opened. My name was written across the front in my father's familiar handwriting, the same careful script he'd used to sign my birthday cards and school permission slips. "Sarah Elizabeth Coleman," he read aloud, and hearing my full name in that formal context made everything feel suddenly irrevocably real. To be opened on the day of her wedding, before the ceremony begins. He held the envelope out to me, and I noticed his hands were completely steady, unlike mine, which were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The envelope was heavier than it should have been, and I could feel something more than paper inside, something small and hard that moved when I tilted it. The key from my dream flashed in my memory, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How long have you had this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 16 years, he replied quietly. "Your father gave it to me the week before he died, along with very specific instructions about when and how it should be delivered. I'm sorry it had to be today, but those were his wishes." He paused, studying my face with the kind of professional assessment that suggested he was used to watching people receive news that changed everything. "Perhaps you'd like to open it somewhere private?" But I was already breaking the seal, driven by that insatiable curiosity that had always been stronger than caution or social appropriateness. Inside the envelope were 3 things that made no sense together. A photograph of my father standing in front of a building I'd never seen before, wearing that same expensive suit from my dream. A key that was indeed old and ornate, made of brass with intricate scrollwork, and a letter in his handwriting that began with words that stopped my heart cold. "My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then you are about to begin your new life, and it's time for you to know who your old man really was." The photograph showed my father standing confidently in front of what appeared to be a very upscale office building, his posture suggesting ownership, authority, success. But this wasn't the man I remembered. This wasn't the guy who wore the same flannel shirts and drove a beat-up truck and worried about making the mortgage payments. This was someone else entirely. Someone who looked like he belonged in boardrooms and country clubs and places where people made the kind of money that changed generations. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the letter, but I kept reading. "I know your mother and I let you believe I was just a simple construction worker, and in many ways, that was true during the last years of my life. But before you were born, I was someone else. I built something significant, something that I walked away from because I realized that the most important construction project of my life was building a family with your mother and creating a childhood for you that was about love, not money." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I forced myself to keep reading. Around me, I was vaguely aware of Mom crying quietly, of Mr. Henley standing respectfully silent, of wedding guests walking past us into the church, probably wondering why the bride was standing in the parking lot reading a letter instead of preparing for her ceremony. But I couldn't stop, couldn't process anything except my father's words reaching across 16 years of silence to rewrite everything I thought I knew about my life. The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Denver. Inside, You'll find documents that explain everything, including details about property and investments I set aside for your future. But more importantly, you'll find a journal I kept during your first few years, explaining why I chose to step back from the business world and why I never regretted that decision, not even for a single day. I looked up at Mom, who was watching me with an expression of profound sadness mixed with what might have been relief. "You knew," I said, and it wasn't a question. "You knew all of this." The betrayal I felt wasn't anger exactly, but something deeper, a fundamental shift in understanding that made me question every conversation we'd ever had, every struggle we'd endured together, every moment when I'd wished we had more money, more options, more security. "He wanted to tell you himself," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We always planned to explain everything when you were older, when you were ready to understand. But then the accident happened, and I thought maybe it was better to let you remember him as the man he chose to be in those last years, not the businessman he'd been before. I thought maybe simplicity was a gift I could give you." But I wasn't listening anymore, because the letter continued, and the next paragraph changed everything again. "Sarah, the property includes a vineyard in the mountains outside Boulder, a place I bought with the dream of someday teaching you about patience and tradition and the kind of success that can't be measured in quarterly reports. It's been maintained by a caretaker all these years, waiting for the day when you might need it, when you might be ready to understand that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money, but the opportunity to discover who you really are when faced with unexpected possibilities." The key felt warm in my palm, like it was alive, like it was already unlocking doors I hadn't known existed. A vineyard, property, investments, a safety deposit box full of secrets. I thought about David, who was probably standing at the altar right now, wondering where his bride had disappeared to. I thought about our carefully planned life, the modest apartment we'd rented, the sensible budget we'd created for our future. None of it included vineyards or mysterious inheritances or fathers who weren't who they seemed to be. "There's more," Mr. Henley said gently, reaching back into his briefcase. "The caretaker has been instructed to meet with you whenever you're ready. The property has been maintained and improved over the years, funded by investments your father made before he stepped away from active business. It's substantial." He handed me another envelope, this one thicker, filled with what looked like legal documents and photographs. I felt like I was drowning in information, in possibilities I'd never imagined, in questions that multiplied faster than I could process them. My wedding was supposed to start in 20 minutes, but I was standing in a parking lot, discovering that my entire life had been built on half-truths and protective omissions. The worst part wasn't the deception, though. The worst part was realizing that some part of me had always known something was missing, some piece of the puzzle that would explain why I'd always felt like I was reaching for something just beyond my grasp. The church bells began to chime, calling guests to take their seats, reminding me that there were people inside waiting for me to walk down the aisle and promise to love David for the rest of my life. But how could I make that promise when I suddenly didn't know who I was anymore? How could I start a marriage with secrets this big sitting between us like uninvited guests? "I need to see David," I said suddenly, clutching the letters and the key against my chest. "I need to tell him about this before," but I couldn't finish the sentence because I didn't know what came after before. Before I walked down the aisle? Before we said our vows? Before we started a life together that might be completely different from anything we'd planned? Mom reached for my hand, her touch gentle but urgent. "Sarah, honey, you don't have to decide anything today. This can wait. Your wedding should be perfect, the way we planned." But her words sounded hollow even to her, because we both knew that perfect was already broken, that the careful life we'd built together was shifting beneath our feet like sand. I looked at the church, its stone walls warm in the morning sunlight, and I could almost see through them to where David was waiting, probably adjusting his tie nervously and wondering if I was having second thoughts. He deserved to know what I'd just learned, deserved to understand that the woman he was about to marry wasn't exactly who either of us had thought she was. But more than that, I needed to know what it meant, all of it, the vineyard and the money and the man in the photograph who looked like my father but lived a life I'd never imagined. The key in my hand felt like a promise and a threat simultaneously, like it could open doors to possibilities I'd never dreamed of, or destroy the simple happiness I'd thought was enough. Everything I had believed about my life, about my family, about the struggles that had shaped me into the woman I'd become, suddenly felt like someone else's story, and I was standing at the threshold of my wedding day, holding the key to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to unlock. I burst through the side door of the church like I was running from a fire, still clutching the letters and that impossible key, my grandmother's dress rustling against the stone floor as I navigated the narrow hallway toward the vestry where David was waiting. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my fingertips, in the spaces between my ribs where panic was building like pressure in a kettle about to scream. The door to the groom's preparation room was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see David adjusting his cufflinks, his movements precise and calm in that way that had always grounded me. His best man, Marcus, was telling some story about their college days, and David was laughing, that genuine laugh that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. He looked so happy, so certain about what the next few hours would bring, and I felt like I was about to shatter that certainty into a million pieces. David. My voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper, but he heard it immediately. He turned toward the door, and the moment he saw my face, his expression shifted from joy to concern so quickly it made my chest ache. "Sarah? What's wrong?" He was across the room in 3 strides, his hands on my shoulders, his eyes searching mine with that intense focus he brought to everything he cared about. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Are you okay? Is your mom okay?" I held up the letters, the key, the photograph, my hands shaking so badly the papers rustled like autumn leaves. "My father," I managed to say, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "David, my father wasn't who I thought he was. We weren't who I thought we were." The words tumbled out in a rush, making no sense even to me, but I couldn't slow down, couldn't organize my thoughts into anything coherent. Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. "Should I give you guys a minute?" But David waved him off without taking his eyes from my face. "Talk to me, Sarah. What happened? What do you mean your father wasn't who you thought?" He guided me to a chair, kneeling beside me, his hands steady on my knees while mine continued their frantic trembling. This was David at his best, calm in crisis, ready to build solutions out of whatever chaos life threw at us. I told him everything, the words spilling out like water through a broken dam. The dream, the lawyer, the photograph of my father in expensive clothes, standing in front of a building that suggested wealth and power, and a life completely different from the one I remembered. The letter explaining that everything we'd struggled through, every scholarship I'd fought for, every double shift Mom had worked, had been unnecessary because there was money, property, investments sitting in a safety deposit box like some kind of cruel joke played on my entire childhood. "A vineyard," I said, holding up the second set of documents Mr. Henley had given me. "David, there's a vineyard in the mountains that's been waiting for me for 16 years. There are photographs here of this incredible property with a stone house and acres of grapevines and equipment that looks like it belongs in Napa Valley, not Colorado." My voice was getting higher, more frantic. "How do I marry you when I don't even know who I am anymore?" David was quiet for a long moment, processing everything with the same methodical approach he brought to architectural problems. Finally, he sat back on his heels and looked at me with those steady gray eyes that had always made me feel safe. "Sarah, listen to me. You are exactly who you've always been. You're the woman who worked 3 jobs to put herself through college because she was too proud to take handouts. You're the person who spent last weekend helping Mrs. Patterson from your old neighborhood move into assisted living because she had no one else. You're the same woman who cried when you saw that homeless veteran outside the grocery store last month and bought him dinner and made me drive around looking for him the next week to make sure he was okay. But what if I'm not?" The question came out as a whisper, carrying all the fear I'd been trying to suppress. "What if I'm actually someone who grew up wealthy and privileged, and I just never knew it? What if the struggles that shaped me weren't real? What if everything that made me who I am was based on a lie? Then we figure it out together. His answer was so simple, so David, that I almost started crying right there. Sarah, we can postpone the wedding if you need time to process this. We can go to Denver right now and open that safety deposit box and learn everything there is to know about your father's life. We can drive to this vineyard and see what it means. But none of that changes how I feel about you. And it doesn't change the fact that I want to spend my life with you, whatever that life turns out to look like. Before I could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. "Excuse me," came a woman's voice I didn't recognize. "I'm looking for Sarah Coleman." David and I exchanged glances, and he went to open the door. Standing in the hallway was an elegantly dressed woman, probably in her 50s, with silver-streaked auburn hair and the kind of understated jewelry that suggested serious money. She looked nervous, but determined, like someone who'd been gathering courage for a difficult conversation. "I'm Sarah," I said, standing up on legs that felt unsteady. "Who are you?" "My name is Catherine Walsh." She stepped into the room, her movements graceful but hesitant. "I knew your father years ago. I heard about the wedding from mutual friends, and I've been debating whether I should come. But when I saw the lawyer arrive, I realized this was the day he'd planned for everything to come out, and I thought you might have questions I could help answer." The room felt too small suddenly, filled with too many people and too many revelations for one morning. David moved closer to me, a protective gesture that I appreciated even though I wasn't sure what I needed protection from. "How did you know my father?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I was ready for another layer of complexity. Catherine's expression softened with what looked like genuine affection mixed with old sadness. "We were business partners many years ago. We built Coleman Walsh Development together, back when your father was still Thomas Coleman, the entrepreneur, before he became Tommy the construction worker and father who wanted to give you a normal childhood." She paused, studying my face like she was looking for traces of the man she'd known. "He talked about you constantly, you know." Even after he decided to step back from the business world, every conversation eventually came around to his brilliant daughter who asked too many questions and was going to change the world someday. Coleman Walsh Development. I repeated the name, trying to make it fit with everything I thought I knew about my family history. "I've never heard of it. It was dissolved when your father decided to retire, but we were quite successful for about 8 years. We specialized in sustainable commercial development. Green buildings before green was trendy. Your father had vision, and I had the business connections to make that vision profitable." Catherine smiled, but there was something wistful about it. "We made a lot of money together, and we made a lot of difference in how buildings were designed and constructed in Colorado during the 90s. David was listening intently, his architect's brain probably processing the implications of my father having been involved in sustainable development decades before it became mainstream. "What made him walk away?" he asked. "From the business, I mean." "You did," Catherine said, looking directly at me. "Well, the idea of you? When your mother got pregnant, your father became obsessed with the kind of childhood he wanted to give you. He'd grown up wealthy, and he'd seen how money could isolate children from real experiences, real relationships, real understanding of what mattered in life. He wanted you to grow up knowing the value of hard work, the satisfaction of earning what you had, the character that comes from facing genuine challenges." I felt like I was listening to someone describe a stranger. "So he just gave up everything? All the money, the success, the business you built together?" "Not gave up, redirected." Catherine reached into her purse and withdrew a thick manila folder. "This is why I came today. These are documents your mother should have received years ago, but she refused to accept them. Your father set up trusts, investments, property holdings that were meant to mature when you reached certain milestones. Getting married was one of those milestones." The folder felt substantial in my hands, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to understand. Inside were property deeds, investment statements, photographs of buildings and land, and what appeared to be a detailed business plan written in my father's careful handwriting. The numbers were staggering, wealth that had been growing and compounding for decades while I'd been working part-time jobs to pay for textbooks. "The vineyard," I said, finding photographs of rolling hills covered in neat rows of grapevines, a stone house that looked like it belonged in Tuscany, and modern equipment that gleamed in the Colorado sunshine. It's real. It's actually real. It was his dream project, Catherine confirmed. He bought the land 3 years before you were born, convinced that Colorado could produce world-class wines if someone approached it with the right combination of traditional techniques and innovative technology. He spent years preparing the soil, selecting the right grape varieties for our climate, designing the facilities. But when you arrived, his priorities shifted completely. David leaned over my shoulder to look at the photographs, his breath warm against my ear. "Sarah, this is incredible. Look at the craftsmanship in that stonework, the way the buildings are positioned to take advantage of the natural light and mountain views. Your father had remarkable aesthetic sense." I was staring at a photograph of the vineyard's main house, and something about it felt familiar in a way that made my chest tight. "I've been here," I said suddenly. "Not recently, but when I was little. I remember this porch, these mountains in the background. I thought it was just a place we visited once, friends of the family or something." "He took you there twice," Catherine said softly. "Once when you were about 4, and once when you were 6. Your mother didn't approve. She thought it was too confusing for you, too much to explain when they were trying to build a simple life. But your father couldn't resist showing you the place he was saving for your future." The memory was coming back now, hazy but real. A long car ride, my father singing along to country music on the radio while Mom sat silent in the passenger seat. The smell of grape leaves and earth, a picnic on a blanket while my parents talked in low voices about things I didn't understand. My father, lifting me up to touch the vines, telling me they were sleeping and would wake up when I was big enough to help them grow. "He never gave up on it," I whispered, tracing the outline of the house with my finger. "Even after he decided to step back from business, he kept this place ready for me." "The caretaker's name is Miguel Santos," Catherine said. "He's been maintaining the property for 16 years, following your father's detailed instructions. The vineyard has been producing small batches of wine, enough to keep the operation viable and cover expenses. But Miguel has been waiting for you to decide what you want to do with it on a larger scale." I looked up at David, who was studying the photographs with the focused attention he brought to any design challenge. "What do you think?" I asked him. "What do you think about all of this?" "I think," he said slowly, "that your father was an incredibly thoughtful man who understood that the best gifts aren't the ones that make life easier, but the ones that make life more meaningful. This isn't just property, Sarah. This is an opportunity to build something together, something that could be a legacy for our children someday. Our children." The phrase hung in the air like a promise and a question mark simultaneously. We'd talked about having kids eventually, but always in the abstract future, after we'd established our careers and saved enough money and figured out all the practical details of adult life. But standing there, looking at photographs of a vineyard that had been waiting for me since before I was born, the idea of children felt suddenly real and immediate and possible in ways I'd never imagined. "There's one more thing," Catherine said, hesitating as if she wasn't sure she should continue. "Your father asked me to give you a message if this day ever came. He said to tell you that none of this money or property or opportunity means anything if it changes who you are fundamentally. He said the most important thing he and your mother ever built wasn't a business or a vineyard or a trust fund. It was you. He wanted you to know that he was proud of the woman you became without any of this, and that he trusted you to decide how much of this legacy you wanted to embrace." I felt tears starting again, but they were different this time. Not the panicked tears of someone whose world was falling apart, but the deeper tears that come when you realize something beautiful and profound that you'd never understood before. My father hadn't abandoned his dreams. He'd transformed them, planted them in soil that would nourish not just grapevines, but generations of possibilities I was only beginning to comprehend. The church bells chimed again, a reminder that we still had a wedding to figure out. I looked at David, at Catherine, at the documents and photographs scattered around the small room like pieces of a puzzle that was finally starting to make sense. "I want to see it," I said suddenly. "The vineyard. I want to see what he built for us." "Now?" David asked, though his tone suggested he already knew what my answer would be. "Now." I stood up, gathering all the papers and photographs, feeling more certain than I had all morning. "David, I can't walk down that aisle until I understand who I am, and I can't understand who I am until I see what my father believed I could become. Is it crazy to postpone our wedding so we can drive to a vineyard I didn't know I owned until an hour ago? Instead of answering immediately, David pulled out his phone and started scrolling through contacts. "Marcus," he called to his best man, who had been standing quietly in the corner, trying to pretend he wasn't listening to the most surreal conversation of his life. "Can you handle telling everyone we need to postpone the ceremony? Family emergency, unexpected development, something diplomatic that doesn't sound like the bride is having a breakdown?" "You're serious?" Marcus asked, though he was already moving toward the door. "You want me to tell 200 people that the wedding is off because you need to go look at some grapes?" "Tell them the wedding isn't off," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "Tell them it's delayed while the bride and groom go discover what kind of life they're actually building together." I looked at David, this man who had just agreed to postpone our carefully planned wedding so we could chase down mysteries and possibilities and truths that had been waiting in the Colorado mountains for 16 years. "Tell them we'll be back when we know what we're celebrating." Catherine smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen on her face since she'd arrived. "Your father would be very proud of that decision," she said. "Very proud indeed." As we prepared to leave, to walk out of the church where our families and friends were waiting for a wedding that would have to wait a little longer, I realized that maybe this was exactly what my father had planned all along. Maybe he'd known that the most important journey David and I would take together wouldn't be down a church aisle, but up a mountain road toward a future neither of us had imagined possible. The key in my hand felt warm with promise, and for the first time since I'd opened that first envelope, I wasn't afraid of what it might unlock. The drive from Colorado Springs to the vineyard took 2 hours through mountain roads that twisted and climbed until the air grew thin and the world spread out below us like a promise written in stone and sky. I'd changed out of my grandmother's wedding dress into jeans and a sweater, but I kept the veil folded carefully in my lap, unable to let go of the day we'd planned, even as we drove toward a completely different future. David handled his truck with the same steady confidence he brought to everything, one hand on the wheel and the other resting on my knee, anchoring me while my entire universe shifted and reformed itself around truths I'd never imagined. Catherine had given us detailed directions to the vineyard, along with Miguel Santos's phone number and a warning that he might be suspicious of unexpected visitors. Miguel has been turning away curious neighbors and potential buyers for 16 years, following Thomas's instructions to keep the place private until you were ready to claim it. The landscape changed as we climbed higher, from the familiar urban sprawl of Colorado Springs to rolling foothills dotted with cattle and horses, then into more dramatic terrain where pine forests gave way to alpine meadows and the kind of vistas that made you understand why people moved to Colorado and never left. "Your father was very protective of the property," she'd explained as we stood in the church parking lot, watching our wedding guests file out in confusion while Marcus did his diplomatic best to explain the situation. I kept checking my phone for messages from Mom, who had stayed behind to help with the complicated logistics of postponing a wedding. But the mountain roads had taken us beyond reliable cell service into a world that felt separate from everything we'd left behind. "Are you nervous?" David asked, glancing at me as we navigated a particularly steep curve. He'd loosened his tie, but was still wearing his wedding suit, looking like a groom who'd gotten lost on the way to his own reception. "Terrified," I admitted. "What if it's nothing like the photographs? What if it's run down or abandoned or not at all what I'm expecting? What if Miguel thinks we're crazy people who showed up claiming to own property that's been in his care for 16 years? I was spiraling again, that familiar anxiety that came when I couldn't control all the variables, couldn't research and plan and prepare for every possible outcome. "Then we figure it out," David said, using the same calm tone he'd used in the church. "Sarah, whatever we find up there, whatever it means for our future, we'll handle it together." That's what marriage is, right? Facing the unexpected as a team, building something meaningful out of whatever life throws at us. The GPS on David's phone announced that we were approaching our destination, but I saw the vineyard before the technology caught up with reality. It appeared around a bend in the mountain road like something from a dream, exactly matching the photographs, but somehow more real, more substantial, more breathtaking than any image could have captured. Rolling hills covered in neat rows of grapevines stretched toward distant peaks, the late afternoon sun casting everything in golden light that made the landscape look painted. The stone house sat at the center of it all, its architecture perfectly suited to the Colorado mountains, while maintaining an old-world elegance that spoke of generations of winemaking tradition. "Jesus," David breathed, pulling over at a scenic overlook so we could take in the full scope of what we were seeing. "Sarah, this is incredible. Look at the way the vineyard is laid out, following the natural contours of the land. And that house, the way it's positioned to catch the morning light and protect against the mountain winds. This isn't just property. This is a masterpiece of agricultural design." I couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the reality of what my father had created and preserved for me. The vineyard was larger than I'd expected, more sophisticated, more obviously the result of serious investment and long-term planning. This wasn't a hobby project or a weekend retreat. This was a legitimate agricultural operation that had been waiting patiently for me to grow up and decide what to do with it. A pickup truck was making its way up the gravel road toward the house, kicking up a cloud of dust that caught the afternoon light. David started his engine and followed, both of us silent now as we approached the moment when abstract possibilities would become concrete realities. The truck stopped in front of the house, and a man got out, shading his eyes as he watched us approach. Miguel Santos looked exactly like someone who'd spent 16 years caring for a vineyard in the Colorado mountains. He was probably in his 60s, with the weathered skin and strong hands of someone who worked outdoors year-round, wearing work clothes that were clean but practical. His expression was cautious, but not unfriendly as we parked and got out of David's truck, and when he saw me, something in his face shifted to what might have been recognition. "You must be Sarah," he said, his accent carrying traces of Spanish that made my name sound musical. "You look like your father around the eyes, but you have your mother's stubborn chin." His smile was gentle, transforming his weathered features into something genuinely welcoming. I wondered when this day would come. "Mr. Santos," I managed, suddenly feeling shy in the presence of this man who'd been caring for my inheritance longer than I'd been an adult. "I'm sorry we didn't call ahead. We just learned about all of this today, and I needed to see it for myself. Miguel, please." He gestured toward the house, its stone walls warm in the afternoon sun. "Your father, he told me that when you came, you might be confused, maybe overwhelmed. He said to show you everything, answer all your questions, help you understand what he built here." His eyes moved to David, taking in the formal clothes and loosened tie with obvious curiosity. "This must be the husband?" "Almost husband," David said, extending his hand. "David Chen. We were supposed to get married this morning, but then we learned about all of this, and Sarah needed to understand her father's legacy before we could move forward with our life together." Miguel's handshake was firm, assessing, the grip of someone who judged people by their actions rather than their words. "Thomas always said that Sarah would marry someone who understood that some things are more important than schedules and social expectations. I think maybe he was right." He turned back to me, his expression becoming serious. "Are you ready to see what your father built for you?" The tour began in the vineyard itself, rows upon rows of grapevines that Miguel explained with the passion of someone who understood that wine was more than agriculture. It was poetry written in soil and sunshine and time. He showed us different grape varieties, explained how the altitude and climate created unique growing conditions, demonstrated techniques for pruning and pest management that had been adapted specifically for Colorado's challenging environment. But more than the technical details, what came through was the love he'd poured into this place, the way he'd honored my father's vision by treating every vine like it mattered, every harvest like it was sacred. "Your father, he had very specific ideas about what kind of wine he wanted to produce here," Miguel explained as we walked between the rows, the late afternoon sun warm on our faces. "Not trying to copy California or France, but something uniquely Colorado, something that captured the character of these mountains and this soil." He stopped beside a particularly healthy-looking vine, its leaves deep green and full of promise. He said wine should tell the story of the place where it's made, and the people who made it. We moved from the vineyard to the production facility, a building that looked rustic from the outside, but contained equipment that was clearly state-of-the-art. Stainless steel tanks gleamed in the afternoon light, and the air carried the complex sense of fermentation and aging wine. Miguel showed us barrels of wine that had been aging for years, explaining the patient process of creating something worth waiting for. He uncorked a bottle of wine that had been made from grapes grown on the property, pouring small amounts into glasses that caught the light like liquid sunshine. "This is from 3 years ago," he said, watching as David and I tasted wine made from vines my father had planted before I was born. "Your father designed the blend, but I've been following his notes, learning his techniques. I always hoped that someday you would taste it and understand what he was trying to create." The wine was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just a beverage, it was a conversation with the land, with time, with the vision of a man who'd understood that the most meaningful legacies are the ones that bring people together around something beautiful and enduring. I could taste the Colorado mountains in it, the high-altitude sunshine, and the careful attention that had gone into every decision from planting to harvest to aging. "It's extraordinary," David said, and I could hear in his voice the same recognition I was feeling, that we weren't just tasting wine, but experiencing a piece of art that had been years in the making. "Miguel, how much wine are you producing here annually?" "Small batches," Miguel replied. "Maybe 200 cases in a good year. Your father's instructions were to focus on quality, not quantity, to learn what worked best in this specific location before thinking about expansion." He looked at me carefully. "But now that you're here, now that you know about this place, those decisions are yours to make." We moved from the production facility to the house, and with each room Miguel showed us, I felt more connected to the father I'd thought I knew, and more amazed by the father I was just discovering. The house was beautiful, but not ostentatious, designed for comfort and functionality rather than display. The kitchen was clearly the heart of the home, with a large table that looked perfect for hosting dinners with friends and family, windows that looked out over the vineyard, and details that spoke of someone who understood that the best hospitality comes from genuine warmth rather than expensive furnishings. But it was the study that undid me completely. Miguel opened the door to reveal a room lined with bookshelves, filled with volumes on viticulture and business and philosophy, and dominated by a large desk where papers were still arranged, as if my father had just stepped away and might return at any moment. On the walls were photographs of the vineyard through different seasons, architectural drawings for expansions that had never been built, and a framed letter from a wine critic praising the exceptional promise of the early vintages produced at the Coleman Vineyard. "He used to sit here every evening," Miguel said softly, "planning for the future, writing in his journal, dreaming about the day when you would join him here and help decide what this place could become." He gestured toward a leather-bound journal sitting open on the desk. He kept detailed records of everything, not just the wine production, but his thoughts about what he was building, what he hoped it would mean for your future. I approached the desk like it was an altar, afraid to disturb anything, but unable to resist reading the words my father had written in his careful handwriting. The journal entry dated just weeks before his death began. "Sarah turned 11 today, and I can see so clearly the woman she's becoming. She asks questions that challenge everything I think I know, and she approaches every problem like a puzzle that can be solved if you're willing to look at it from enough angles. I think she's going to be ready for this place sooner than I expected, but I hope I have many more years to prepare both the vineyard and myself for the day when I can share it with her." I had to sit down, the weight of his words and his absence hitting me like a physical blow. David was beside me immediately, his hand on my shoulder, as I processed the reality that my father had been thinking about this moment, planning for this day, writing about his hopes for my future, right up until the accident that took him away before any of it could happen the way he'd imagined. "There's more," Miguel said gently. "Much more. Financial records, business plans, correspondence with distributors who have been waiting years for permission to carry Coleman Vineyard wines. Your father built something here that could support not just your family, but dozens of families in the community. The question is whether you want to continue what he started, or whether you need to find your own path." as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that made the vineyard look like something from a fairy tale. David and I sat on the porch of the house my father had built for a future he'd never lived to see. Miguel had given us space to process everything, to talk through the possibilities and implications and decisions that suddenly seemed to define the rest of our lives. "I keep thinking about what Catherine said," I told David, watching the last light fade from the sky, about how my father trusted me to decide how much of this legacy I wanted to embrace. "Part of me wants to stay here forever, to learn everything Miguel can teach me about making wine and running this business and honoring what my father built. But another part of me is terrified that I'll lose myself in someone else's dream, even if that someone was my father." David was quiet for a long moment, considering his words with the same care he brought to designing buildings that would stand for generations. "What if it's not about choosing between his dream and yours?" he finally said. "What if it's about taking the foundation he built and creating something that's authentically ours? You're not the same person your father was, and the wine industry isn't the same as it was when he started this place. Maybe the question isn't whether to continue his work, but how to transform it into something that reflects who we are and what we want to build together." As if summoned by our conversation, Miguel appeared with a bottle of wine and 3 glasses. "This one is special," he said, settling into a chair beside us. "The last bottle your father made before he died, before he stepped back from the business world to focus on being your father. He said to save it for the day you came home to claim your inheritance." The wine was perfect, complex, and nuanced in ways that spoke of careful attention and deep understanding of the craft. But more than that, it tasted like love, like a father's hope for his daughter's future, like a gift that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. As we sat there sharing wine and watching stars appear in the mountain sky, I realized that my father hadn't just left me property or money or even a business opportunity. He'd left me a choice, a chance to decide who I wanted to become, armed with resources and possibilities I'd never imagined. The key he'd given me through that lawyer wasn't just for a safety deposit box or a vineyard gate. It was for doors I hadn't even known existed, futures I was only beginning to glimpse. When I called Mom from the landline in the house to tell her we were staying the night, her voice carried relief, mixed with something that might have been pride. "Your father always said you'd know what to do when the time came," she said. I think maybe he was right about that too. David and I fell asleep in the house my father had built for dreams he'd never lived to see realized. And when I woke up to sunrise over the Rocky Mountains, streaming through windows that perfectly framed the vineyard and the valleys beyond, I knew that tomorrow we'd drive back to Colorado Springs and reschedule our wedding. But it would be a different wedding now, a celebration of a different future, a promise to build something together that honored the past while embracing possibilities we were only just beginning to understand. The key my father had left me had unlocked more than just secrets about his hidden life. It had unlocked a future I never could have imagined. And for the first time since that lawyer had appeared at the church, I wasn't afraid of what that future might hold.